Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I am so pleased that you are with me today. Today is our location-specific episode all about the last and final location in Canada, Northwest Territories. Yay. If you've been following the show for a while, you know in all of my location-specific episodes that I have included hyperlinks to the locations, tenancy laws, tenancy acts, all kinds of helpful hints. And today's no exception. In fact, today I actually only have, let's see, six. Normally I have more, but there isn't a whole lot up in Northwest Territories, and it's not very populated, so I guess that makes sense. But that's okay. And the whole goal of today's episode is to answer the same four questions that I do with all my location-specific podcasts. And I answer four questions. One, what are the basics of this location's Tenancy Act? Two, what are the nuances? What's different? What stands out? Three, what about guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in this location? And four, where do you get help in the local area? Like if you're just stuck, what do you do? And so those are the same four questions I answer on all of my location specific podcasts. And as I answer these questions, you'll see me screen share all kinds of documents. I'll go through the hyperlinks. If we find an extra one, I add it to the show notes so you can see, follow along. So make sure you're watching this on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord. That is the easiest way to digest this content for you. Um, so over the years, I've been doing so many of these episodes. I've created the bingo card of standard items that I see most often in tenancy laws in these different locations. And you'll see me at the very end of the episode go through that bingo card to help figure out what you need to research more, especially if you have questions. Now, I must tell you, there are more guiding documents than what I'm giving you here. This may not be everything. And even if I get it 100% right at the time of recording, things can and will change even 5 minutes after we're done. So make sure you're doing your own research. This is not all inclusive, but it is a running start for you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to screen share on the first on the first hyperlink. So the first thing I found was the Northwest Territories Residential Tenancies Act. It's 68 pages long. Now, remember, a tenancy act or tenancy law is a law. So you're going to see this is very um, legalese because it is. And then we're going to go into some of the other hyperlinks, which is way more user friendly. There's a lot more clicking and hyperlinks and forms and things like that. And so it'll be way easier to digest. But I always start with the source document if possible. And so there's all kinds of lists as we scroll through some of these regarding lease assignments, landlord obligation, tenant obligations. I'm sure it'll get into, here we go, rent increases, termination of the lease agreements, abandoned personal property. Here it is. We're going to go through all of this. Overholding tenants, which that word tells me that there is an abrupt end at the end of a fixed term that they have to renew between the landlord and the tenant. So there's different wording as you go through here. Rental officers. Northwest Territory has a very different setup regarding this because it's not very populated. And so you actually apply to a rental officer for different aspects, including disputes and things like that, which we'll get into. Let's see. I'm gonna keep going. And of course, it's in English and in French. So if you're seeing this, you'll see that there are two columns, one per language. And of course, as normal, it starts out with a bunch of definitions. There's a bit of glossary. It talks about application. Um, yeah, as we go through here, tenancy agreements, what has to be included as a tenancy agreement. Okay, so here's a pet deposit. A landlord should not require or receive a pet security deposit from a tenant who has continuously occupied the rental starting in 2010. Okay, well, so if you've been in the unit for 16 years, okay, you probably don't have the same pet, but it looks like it's talking all about pet security deposits. Wow, like straight up. So it's talking about security deposits and then it goes into pet security deposits. Looks like 1 month. Looks like the security deposit limit is 1 month, and looks like I'm just trying to find out how much the 50% of the rent for 1 month, so half month's rent. So it looks like if you are renting to a tenant in Northwest Territories that has a security deposit and then a pet, then it looks like you can do 1 month security deposit for the unit and then a half month's rent for the pet. And I'm just going to keep going. Entry, yeah, this is condition inspections. Yeah, and condition inspection upon commencement and inspection during tenancy for the pet deposit. So you have to give proper notice and then you can go in. Form of entry inspection report, copy to the tenant for sure. And then interest on the security deposits. Landlord who receives an amount as security deposit or pet security deposit in respect of rental premises shall calculate interest on the amount at a rate determined in accordance with the regulations and shall annually credit the interest to the tenant on the statement of account maintained in respect to the deposit. So you do have to pay periodic interest. Deposits held in trust. The landlord shall hold all security deposits, pet security deposits, and interest in trust. That's typical. There's a couple different ways. Sometimes locations just say that the deposits have to be in a separate account. Does not have to be interest bearing. It can be, doesn't have to be. And then other locations really specify where they want, and then you have to tell the tenant and whatever. And so it doesn't look like that is the case in the Northwest Territories. Inspection on termination. You've got to do a move out inspection. You've got to do an inspection upon abandonment. Here we go. So a landlord or his or her agent, with or without the tenant, conduct an inspection of the condition and contents of the rental premises abandoned by the tenant within 1 week after the day the landlord ascertains that the tenant has abandoned the rental premises. And of course, you've got to give all copies of all documents to the tenant. Return a deposit. One thing I must tell you about reading through this, if you're following along at YouTube, on the left-hand side, there's like little topics as it goes through. Super helpful because there's no titling in the law. It's running on the other side, which is actually kind of cool. So I'm just looking, return a deposit. Looks like the landlord who holds a security deposit, pet security, or both shall within 10 days ensure that the deposit is either returned to the tenant or that the tenant is given an itemized statement of accounts for the deposit or deposits. 10 days. That's actually really fast. Wow. Failure to complete reports, withholding an amount, contents of notice. Yep. So if this is talking about access. Application to a rental officer. Let's look at this. When the application of a tenant, a rental officer determines that the landlord has breached an obligation under Section 18, has failed to return an amount of security deposit, pet security deposit, or both, rental officer. So basically looks like there's a person, instead of going to arbitration, you don't have an arbitrator like you do in other provinces and territories in Canada. You've got a rental officer. It sounds like it's just a different title to me. Interesting. Interesting. Change of landlord. That doesn't necessarily apply. Your deposits would transfer. Change of tenant by assignment. Okay, subletting. Charge for consent. I'm just scrolling down to make sure that anything big that is on the bucket bingo card, like rent increases, late fees, landlord retaliation, any of that low-hanging fruit. I know there's very likely in the other hyperlinks as well, but let's just see. Political canvas. Okay, interesting. Hmm. Notice to rental officer, quiet enjoyment. No landlord shall disturb a tenant's possession or enjoyment of the rental premises or residential complex. Of course. Posting of directory, late payment. Here we go. A tenant who pays his or her late rent later than the date specified by the tenancy agreement is liable to a penalty calculated in accordance with the regulations, but it doesn't say what it is or the limits. Interesting. Maybe we'll find it later on. Multiple entries, like quiet enjoyment is there again. Oh, overcrowding. This is interesting. A tenant shall not permit such number of persons to occupy the rental premises on a continuing basis that contravents health, safety, or housing standards, or is in breach of tenancy agreement. Well, that's pretty much standard. Cannabis, rent increases. No landlord shall increase the rent in respect of a rental premises until 12 months have expired from the date of the last rent increase or the date of which rent was first charged, which is typical. If you're going to note rent increase, it's either once every 12 months or there's no requirements, right? So effective date of the increase. So you've got to give 3 months notice. And it looks like doesn't say how much, but I'm betting if we were to Google it, it would say every time from like the amount of the rent increase that's permitted. In fact, let's do that really quick. Northwest Territory rent increase 2026, 2.3. Bingo, there it is. Okay, early termination by a tenant where a tenant dies or health and physical condition of the tenant deteriorates and the tenant is unable to pay rent, or where a spouse of a tenant dies and income of the surviving spouse is insufficient to pay rent, the tenant, his or her heirs, assigns, or legal or personnel representative may terminate the tenancy agreement by giving notice. That's being a good human, of course. Okay. I am going to go to the next hyperlink. So this one is the Northwest Territories rental office, and this one has a ton of hyperlinks on it. So you can see on the right side, related pages, cannabis information for tenants and landlords, rental agreement for dispute resolution, rental agreements, rental officer decisions. You can actually look at the precedents. Documents and forms. Let's just go to abandoned property first, right? And there's a whole bunch. In fact, I've put this as a separate hyperlink because I specifically am trying to figure out more ways to provide value for abandoned property. So if you are a Northwest Territories landlord and you've got an abandonment situation, this can be intimidating, right? This can really be intimidating. So let me open this up, show you what this looks like. So, abandonment, personal property, report of sale and distribution of proceeds. Now, if this was me, if this happened to me, the first thing I would do is I would call the rental officer and I would just say, this is the situation. Tell me what forms. You can figure it out and we're going to figure it out together, but I would just phone them. And the phone number is right here at the bottom of any of these websites. Northwest Territories rental office. It's in Yellowknife, and there's the phone number and there's the website, right? So, which is the website we were just on. So this is talking about how much the sales of the proceeds for abandoned property. Let's open the next one. This is the inventory list, which is very typical. I've seen this many other times in other locations. Report of return or requested to dispose. This is typically if you've got like food, things like that. Yeah. Oh, no, this is the longer term stuff. So if the tenant or owner picks up the property during a 60-day storage period, complete this section, mail to the rental office. Basically, you're reporting saying they abandoned it, but they came and got their stuff within 60 days. This one, request to dispose. You're basically saying, look, I've kept it for 60 days. At this point, if you're 60 days in, you've tried to recover the unit, it's empty. Hopefully you've re-rented it, right? But you're still dealing with storage fees. You're still dealing with the costs of storing all this stuff. Date property was put into storage. Was the tenant provided a copy of the inventory? No, provide reason why. It could have been anything. It could be the person is incarcerated. He or she is in the hospital. They fled the country. They've been arrested. It could be anything. They're on life support. They were, you know, mortally wounded, like they're in a coma, something like that, where you can say tenant was not provided a copy of the inventory or their emergency contact was something like that, right? But this form is the request to dispose. Report of sale of abandoned personal property. Let's open this last one, which we've already done. Okay. Yeah. So you want to inventory it. Okay, so and then at the very bottom of all this, here's the rental office again. It gives you the email address and the phone number. Yeah, use the following link to submit an application to the rental office. I'm just going to go through this. File drop requires authentication email. Okay, so I'm actually not going to do this. No, I won't do this. If this applies to you, go down that rabbit hole, but I'm not going to do that right now. Let's go here. Rental officer decisions. Um, rental tenants regulations. Let's open that one. Okay, here's the regulations. This one's 19 pages. So you had the act and then you have you have, this one is good. I'm actually going to add this to the show notes because this one is quite good. I'm actually pretty happy with that. There we go. So this is basically your tenancy agreement, your pre-made tenancy agreement. So if you're a Northwest Territory landlord or you're about to be, make sure you're using these forms. Um, and they have them in English and in French. Here's the rent, services and facilities, what's included, what's not included. So it goes one page is English, one page is French. Security deposit required, obligation of landlord to maintain premises, and then obligations under the act. It talks about what the landlord and the tenant are supposed to do or not supposed to do. And then it does it in French again. No overcrowding, and it explains the maximum occupancy, X amount of persons to occupy. Service of notice. How does the tenant and the landlord both want to be served? Right? You can do it by email, but you have to acknowledge that you want to be doing it by email in Northwest Territories. This is actually very helpful because other places they say you can, but then it doesn't actually do this formal acknowledgement, right? It's kind of interesting that they specifically do this right in the lease, which is great. And then termination by notice. And so it talks about the timing of what actually is proper notice in both English and in French. Termination for cause. And there it is. That is fantastic. That is a good thing. That's a gooder. Okay, rental officer, search terms, like there's a whole bunch of different ones. Legislation in the Northwest Territories, resolve disputes. Yeah, you want to make sure you've got all that. Okay, let's keep going on. Rental agreements, which we talked about. Okay, so the next one I have is Legal Aid Society for Northwest Territories. So you want to make sure. And I always have to make sure that this is for Canada because there is a Northwest Territories in Australia as well. So you want to make sure. So if you've got a question about legal items for the public, you can just phone them. You can email them as well and just say, this is my problem. What should I do? What should I go? I would start with the rental officer first, and they can guide you more. Now, also, when I'm doing these location-specific podcasts, I'm specifically trying to make sure you have all the places that you can possibly learn how to be a better landlord. If you're a tenant listening to this, how to be a better tenant. And as such, there is a Northwest Territories Facebook group for tenants. And so this is a copy of it. I actually have included that in the show notes. And so this is also based in Yellowknife. They do have a phone number. They do have an email. And I'm a member of like the Maui Tenants Association. I'm in there. Absolutely. Why wouldn't I? Okay, next one is Law Society Northwest. This is the same thing, the legal aid, but it's a different page. So I put them both in here. Maybe I didn't need to, but I did. And I think oh, right. This is not legal aid. What this is the Bar Association. This is like where the lawyers are. Yes, that's why I have this in here. So I have legal aid is one. It looks very similar, but this is for um, if you need legal help. Now it looks like it's the same thing, and maybe it is, but find a lawyer, discuss that. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing because I've essentially exhausted our hyperlinks. And I'm just going to hit the bingo card. We're just going to go through here. So tenant application fee, it does not state anything specific in Northwest Territory Residential Tenancy Acts. Grace period for late rent without penalty, again, not specified. Late fee amount. I did find a late fee amount. Late fee penalty must not exceed $5 plus $1 for each day after the due date that the rent is late to a maximum of $65. So you have a flat rate amount. Security deposit method, we talked about this already. Security deposits must be kept in a separate institution. So it must be in a trust account in a financial institution. Lease wording. Yeah, there's a bit about lease wording. In fact, if you're using the standard form, this should not be an issue. So just use your standard template form that is now a hyperlink in the episode. Emergency contact required in the event of abandonment, incapacitation, death, or imprisonment, not specified by statute, but it's also best practice. So make sure you're doing it. Pets and animals, pet deposit or pet rent. Yes, a landlord may require pet security deposit, but cannot be greater than a half a month's rent and cannot have multiple pet deposits. It's just one deposit regardless of the number of pets. And it's not for service animals because the service animal has a job. That's not a pet. Okay, delivery of a signed lease is required. Yes, it must be delivered to the tenant within 60 days. I try to do it the same day. So then it's done. Is a condition inspection required at the time of move-in? The answer is yes. The landlord or the agent must conduct an inspection, which goes hand in hand, right? You do a condition inspection, you're holding a security deposit, and then when they depart, you do the condition inspection on the move out, and then you know if is it normal wear and tear, is it willful damage, etc., right? Are there standard warning letters or wording templates? The answer is yes. There is some standard templates that we saw, but there is no standard warning letters or wording necessarily. Required maintenance inspections are not specified by statute. Rent increases we covered. Proper notice is 3 months. And how much can the rent increase? It is noted. We actually did the Google search, so they will tell you, the province will tell you, or the territory will tell you. Renter's insurance is not required nor mentioned. It's not specified by statute. Abuse of access for landlords and to give proper notice is not explicitly defined. However, it does regulate the landlord's right to enter the premises, and you do have to give proper notice. So it is defined, it's just not called abusive access. Is landlord retaliation defined and or timing? It does not explicitly define retaliation. However, it defines remedies for improper termination in certain circumstances. For example, if the tenant treats a notice of rent increase as notice of termination and the rental officer determines the landlord did not genuinely intend to increase the rent, the landlord may be ordered to pay the tenant's moving expenses or compensation increased rent for up to 12 months. And similar remedies exist if a landlord improperly terminates tenancy for their own use or sale of the property. A fixed term tenancy agreement. Oh, it does automatically renew as a monthly periodic unless it's specified other, even though they had a holdover word in the act. That's interesting. But okay. Is there an acceleration clause if the tenant terminates early? Tenancy agreement must not contain provision to affect the breach of the tenant's obligation of the tenancy agreement. Basically, no, there's no acceleration clause, meaning if they terminate early, they're not on the hook for the rest of the lease amount. Condition inspection at move out. The answer is yes. Return of deposit or return of the deposit within 10 days. We talked about that. Yeah. Can you use the deposit as last month's rent? Yes or no? Not explicitly allowed by statute. Typically, we do not like to do that because it's all money, but it's not the same money, right? Penalty for not returning the deposit within 10 days. If a landlord breaches an obligation or fails to return a deposit that is owing, rental officer may be order the landlord to comply and we'll have to return it, but there doesn't appear to be any penalty. That's okay. How long until you can give notice of eviction due to non-payment of rent? Looks like it does not specify a fixed number of days on anything, including mischief. Yeah. And then abandoned properties. We talked about doing an inventorying of the items. You've got to provide an inventory approved to the rental officer and a copy to the tenant if possible. And then you can report after it's held for at least 60 days, request to dispose of the property. And then anything else that's unique or different, notable aspect of Northwest Territory landlord-tenant laws is significant role of the rental officer in resolving disputes and issuing orders for termination, compliance, compensation, rather than prescribing a fixed notice period for all breaches. Many actions, such as eviction for non-payment or lease violations, require an application to a rental officer who then determines the appropriate action and timeline. The Act also explicitly defines conditions for a tenant abandoning or vacating the premises based on rent payment. Awesome. That's it. That's to the end of Northwest Territories. That's pretty quick. Each of my location-specific podcasts, once again, answers 4 questions. What are the basics of that location? What are the nuances of that location? Guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant, and then where to get help in your local real estate or province. You saw me keep track on my bingo card. I went through the bingo card. This was actually very simple. And I think it's because the Northwest Territories is a big geographic area, but it's not very populated. And so that's probably why they have an individual who is your point of contact. One more time, I must tell you that this episode is not all inclusive. You must research further in your specific area, including county, regional district, parish, city, municipality, or other governing body that might involve your rental location, in this case, the Northwest Territories. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you're either new to real estate or you want to be new to real estate in Northwest Territories. Things you can do to help yourself are make sure you go through all the hyperlinks, including reading the Northwest Territories Residential Tenancies Act. And 2, get in the conversation with other landlord real estate people in the Northwest Territories. You can either physically get in the room with them via meetups and conferences, or you can get into social media outlets of all kinds. There may not be a Northwest Territories Facebook group necessarily, but there are landlord groups in general, and actually you'll see me in there as well. So you want to get in the conversation, learn from people, ask questions, because other landlords want to help other landlords. That's true. I hope you enjoyed today's show all about the Northwest Territories. Don't forget to subscribe for more expert advice and real stories from across the rental property world. I'm recording this episode today from my boat in Powell River, BC, in the South Harbor of Westview. And it is absolutely storming to beat the band outside. Why do I always mention this? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me next week. Actually, join me right now in the next episode, which is already live, episode 237, about the state of Connecticut. I will see you there.